The emergency dispatch crackled to life at exactly 2:47 a.m., pulling Officer Rebecca Martinez from her paperwork with a jolt that sent coffee splashing across her desk. The voice on the other end belonged to Tommy Chen from the downtown precinct, but it didn't sound like him at all. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced by something raw and trembling. "We need backup at Mercy General Hospital, now. I don't know how to explain what I'm seeing here." Rebecca exchanged glances with her partner, Officer Catherine Wilson, a 15-year veteran whose steel-gray eyes had seen just about everything the city could throw at them. Kate was already reaching for her radio, her instincts apparently screaming the same warning that Rebecca felt crawling up her spine. They'd been working the graveyard shift together for 3 years, and Rebecca had learned to trust that look on Kate's face, the one that said tonight was going to be different from all the other nights. As they rushed to their patrol car, the radio exploded with multiple calls, all coming from the hospital district, all describing impossible things that made no sense in the ordered world of law enforcement. People attacking each other with their teeth. Victims who wouldn't stay down no matter how many times security tried to restrain them. A nurse screaming about her colleague who died from a heart attack an hour ago now walking the corridors with milky white eyes. The drive to Mercy General took 8 minutes, but it felt like hours as more reports flooded in, each one more disturbing than the last. Rebecca's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white, while Kate coordinated with dispatch, her voice steady even as the information coming through grew increasingly bizarre. Lieutenant Jennifer Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos, commanding all available units to establish a perimeter around the hospital, standard protocol, but something in her tone suggested she knew this was anything but standard. When they arrived, the scene before them looked like something torn from a nightmare and pasted onto the familiar streets of their city. The hospital's emergency entrance blazed with fluorescent light, and silhouetted against that harsh glow were shapes that moved wrong, jerking and lurching with a gait that no living person should have. Officer Diana Campbell was backing away from the entrance, her weapon drawn but shaking in her hands, while her partner Officer Michelle Turner was shouting into her radio for medical assistance for a fallen security guard. But even from a distance, Rebecca could see that no medical assistance would help the man on the ground. Half his throat was missing, torn away by what looked like human teeth, and the amount of blood pooling beneath him told a story that ended only one way. Kate was out of the car before Rebecca had fully processed the scene, moving with the decisive action of someone who understood that hesitation killed. "Campbell, Turner, fall back to our position." Kate's command voice cut through the confusion, and the 2 younger officers retreated gratefully toward the patrol cars that were now forming a loose semicircle around the hospital entrance. Rebecca joined her partner, her own service weapon now drawn, her training taking over even as her mind struggled to categorize what her eyes were reporting. The figures emerging from the hospital were people, or had been people, but something fundamental had changed in them. They moved without purpose beyond a hunger that was written in every lurching step, and their eyes held no recognition, no humanity, nothing but an empty void that made Rebecca's blood run cold. A woman in scrubs, her name tag identifying her as Dr. Patricia Holmes, stumbled through the automatic doors, her mouth opening and closing in a grotesque parody of breathing, dark blood staining her chin and neck. Behind her came more, an elderly man still wearing a hospital gown, a young paramedic whose uniform was torn and soiled, a security guard whose radio still squawked with unanswered calls for his status. Lieutenant Rodriguez arrived with 3 more units, and suddenly there were a dozen officers facing down an enemy that none of their training had prepared them for. "Nobody fires unless I give the command," Rodriguez ordered, her dark eyes assessing the situation with the quick calculation that had earned her the promotion to lieutenant at just 34. "Those are still citizens until we know otherwise. We contain, we protect, and we figure out what the hell is happening here." But even as she spoke, the hospital doors opened again, and this time it wasn't a slow trickle of confused individuals, it was a wave of bodies, dozens of them, all moving with that same terrible hunger, all fixated on the living officers standing between them and the sleeping city beyond. The wave of bodies crashed against the invisible barrier of the officers' resolve like a tide against rocks, and in that moment, Lieutenant Jennifer Rodriguez made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, however long that might be. Fall back to defensive positions. Use the vehicles as barriers. Her command rang out clear and strong, cutting through the moans that now filled the air, sounds that were almost human but missing some crucial element that made them deeply, fundamentally wrong. Rebecca and Kate moved in perfect synchronization, years of partnership allowing them to communicate without words as they repositioned their patrol car to create a choke point in the hospital's main driveway. Officer Amanda Stevens, a rookie who'd been on the force for barely 6 months, stumbled as she backed toward the forming perimeter, her face pale with shock, but Officer Lisa Morgan caught her arm and steadied her with a firm grip and a look that said, "I've got you, kid." The creatures, because that's what they were now, Rebecca realized with a sick certainty, no longer people but something that wore human skin like an ill-fitting costume, kept coming, their numbers swelling with each passing moment as more emerged from the hospital's multiple exits. The first real test came when one of the creatures, a man in a business suit who must have been visiting a patient when whatever this was had started, managed to break through the line where 2 patrol cars hadn't quite connected. He lunged toward Officer Diana Campbell with surprising speed, his arms outstretched and his jaw working in anticipation of a meal he would never taste. Diana's training took over, and she used her baton to deflect him, the impact solid enough that the crack of metal against bone echoed across the parking lot, but the creature barely registered the blow that should have shattered his collarbone. He kept coming, kept reaching, until Kate's boot caught him in the chest and sent him sprawling backward into 3 more of his kind, creating a domino effect that bought them precious seconds. "They don't feel pain," Kate shouted, her voice carrying the weight of a terrible realization. "Standard defensive measures won't work." Lieutenant Rodriguez processed this information with the rapid calculation of a battlefield commander, her mind already adjusting tactics and strategies to account for an enemy that operated outside all known parameters. Officer Vanessa Price, who'd been coordinating with dispatch from inside her patrol car, suddenly burst out with news that made the situation infinitely worse. "Lieutenant, we're getting reports from 3 other hospitals across the city. Presbyterian, St. Luke's, and Riverside Medical. Same scenario at all of them. And there are calls coming in from residential areas too, attacks, people behaving violently, victims describing the attackers as looking dead." The implication settled over the assembled officers like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't an isolated incident, wasn't some localized outbreak of drug-induced violence or a gas leak causing hallucinations. This was widespread, coordinated in a way that suggested purpose even if the individual creatures seemed mindless. Rebecca felt her stomach drop as she thought about her sister Maria and her 2 kids living over in the Riverside district, right near Riverside Medical, but she forced the fear down into a tight ball and locked it away because the moment she let personal terror take over was the moment she became useless to everyone, including her family. The perimeter was holding, barely, as more officers arrived to reinforce the line, but the creatures kept coming in ever-increasing numbers, and Rebecca could do the math as well as anyone. Eventually, the sheer weight of bodies would overwhelm their position. Lieutenant Rodriguez was on her radio, her conversation terse and heated with what had to be the precinct captain or maybe someone even higher up the chain of command, and from the expression on her face, she wasn't getting the answers or support she needed. Officer Michelle Turner, who'd been a combat medic in the Army before joining the police force, was moving along the line checking on each officer, making sure everyone was holding together mentally and physically, her presence a steadying influence that kept panic from taking root. "We're going to get through this," Michelle told each of them, her conviction almost strong enough to make it true. "We've trained for crisis situations, and we adapt. That's what we do." But even as she spoke those words, the main hospital building behind the growing horde of creatures suddenly went dark, floor by floor, as if something inside was systematically cutting the power, and in that spreading darkness, more shapes began to move, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, all heading toward the thin line of brave women who stood between the undead and the unsuspecting city. The darkness spreading through Mercy General Hospital brought with it a sound that would live in Rebecca Martinez's nightmares forever, a collective moan of hunger that rose from hundreds of throats simultaneously, creating a chorus of the damned that echoed off the surrounding buildings and seemed to make the very air vibrate with menace. Lieutenant Jennifer Rodriguez made her second crucial decision of the night, and this one came with the bitter taste of tactical retreat. We can't hold this position. All units fall back to the intersection of 5th and Memorial Drive. We establish a new perimeter there and protect the residential zones. The order went against every instinct that told them to stand their ground, to protect the hospital and anyone who might still be alive inside, but Rodriguez was thinking bigger now, thinking about the entire city that sprawled out beyond this single point of crisis. Officer Catherine Wilson grabbed Rebecca's arm and pulled her toward their patrol car, both of them providing cover fire with their weapons for the first time that night, and Rebecca felt the recoil jolt through her arms as she aimed for the heads of the approaching creatures, some primal instinct telling her that's where the kill shot would be, even though the word kill felt wrong when applied to things that already seemed dead. The retreat was controlled chaos, a carefully orchestrated withdrawal that kept formation even as the horde surged forward to fill the space the officers abandoned. Officer Amanda Stevens was crying as she drove, tears streaming down her young face, but her hands were steady on the wheel and she never lost position in the convoy of patrol cars racing toward the new defensive line. Officer Lisa Morgan rode beside her, already on the radio coordinating with the other precincts, trying to build a picture of what was happening across the entire city, and the picture that emerged was apocalyptic in scope. 7 hospitals now reporting incidents. Multiple nursing homes. 3 schools where night staff had been working. A prison on the eastern edge of the city had gone completely dark and silent, which might have been the most terrifying news of all because that facility held over 2,000 inmates, and if whatever this was had gotten inside those walls, it meant 2,000 new creatures would soon be added to the growing army of undead. Rebecca's radio crackled with a personal call sign, and her heart nearly stopped when she heard her sister Maria's voice, strained but alive, reporting that she and the kids had locked themselves in their attic and could hear things breaking into the houses on their street. "Stay there, stay quiet, don't make any noise," Rebecca instructed, her professional training warring with the primal need to abandon everything and race to her family's rescue. "I'm going to get to you, I promise, but right now you need to be invisible." The intersection of 5th and Memorial Drive offered better defensive positioning, a wide-open crossroads with good sight lines in all directions and several reinforced buildings that could serve as fallback positions if needed. Lieutenant Rodriguez was already coordinating with Fire Captain Angela Morrison, whose crew had arrived with 2 engines and was setting up floodlights to eliminate any dark corners where the creatures could approach unseen. The fire captain was a tall woman with burn scars running up her left arm, a veteran of a warehouse fire that had nearly killed her 5 years ago, and she approached this new nightmare with the same calm efficiency that had saved lives in that inferno. "We can use the water cannons to knock them back without lethal force," Morrison suggested, still thinking in terms of preserving life, still hoping that whatever had happened to these people could be reversed. Officer Vanessa Price, who'd been monitoring emergency services radio traffic, shook her head with a grim expression. "CDC is reporting that anyone bitten by the infected becomes infected themselves within minutes. Death follows quickly, then reanimation. This is a contagion, and it's spreading exponentially." The weight of that information settled over the assembled first responders like a death sentence because it meant every person they'd seen fall tonight would soon join the ranks of the enemy, meant the horde would keep growing while their own numbers could only diminish. Officer Diana Campbell, who'd been the first to encounter the creatures up close, finally spoke up with the question everyone had been avoiding. "What happens if we can't contain this? What happens if the perimeter fails?" Lieutenant Rodriguez looked at each of her officers in turn, these brave women who'd signed up to protect and serve but never imagined serving would look like this. "Then we fall back again, and we keep falling back, and we protect every civilian we can until help arrives or until there's nowhere left to fall back to. But that's not going to happen tonight, because this line is going to hold." Even as she spoke those words with absolute conviction, the first wave of creatures rounded the corner 3 blocks away, a shambling mass of bodies that had once been patients and doctors and visitors and staff, all of them now reduced to mindless hunger, all of them heading straight for the intersection where a small group of determined women prepared to stand against the tide of undead that threatened to swallow their entire world. The creatures hit the defensive line at 5th and Memorial like a wave crashing against a seawall, and for the first terrifying moments, it seemed like the hastily constructed perimeter might shatter under the sheer weight of numbers. Fire Captain Angela Morrison's crew unleashed the water cannons, and the high-pressure stream sent bodies tumbling backward, limbs flailing as they lost their footing on the wet pavement, but they just kept getting back up, kept pushing forward with that relentless hunger that knew no fear and felt no pain. Officer Rebecca Martinez had emptied 2 magazines already, each headshot dropping a creature permanently, confirming what horror movies had always suggested: destroy the brain and they stayed down. But for every one that fell, 3 more seemed to take its place, and Rebecca could feel the mathematical certainty of their defeat creeping into her thoughts like ice water through her veins. Lieutenant Jennifer Rodriguez had positioned herself at the critical center point of their formation, her weapon firing with mechanical precision, her voice never stopping as she called out targets and coordinated movements, transforming a group of frightened officers into something resembling an organized military unit. Officer Catherine Wilson had taken charge of the left flank, where a narrow alley threatened to become a breach point if the creatures figured out how to flank their position, though "figured out" implied cognitive function these things clearly didn't possess. Still, the press of bodies was creating a funnel effect that pushed more and more of them toward that vulnerable point, and Kate was cycling through officers to give each a chance to reload and catch their breath, understanding that exhaustion would kill them as surely as teeth and grasping hands. Officer Michelle Turner had set up a triage station in the lobby of a closed bank behind their line, preparing for casualties that seemed inevitable, her military medical training providing protocols for battlefield injuries even if nothing in any manual covered what to do about bites that guaranteed infection, death, and reanimation. Officer Vanessa Price burst from one of the patrol cars with news that cut through the sound of gunfire and moaning like a knife. National Guard has been activated. They're saying 2 hours until the first units arrive. 2 hours might as well have been 2 years given the current rate of ammunition expenditure and the growing size of the horde pressing against their position. Officer Amanda Stevens, the rookie who'd been crying during the retreat, had found something inside herself during the fighting, some core of strength that turned fear into focused determination. She was holding the right flank with Officer Diana Campbell, and the two of them had developed an efficient rhythm where Amanda would knock the creatures back with her baton while Diana made the kill shots, conserving ammunition by making every bullet count. Officer Lisa Morgan had climbed to the roof of the bank building and was serving as their eyes, calling out movement patterns and concentrations of creatures, giving Rodriguez the tactical information she needed to shift resources before weak points became breakthrough points. "Lieutenant, we've got a massive group coming up Memorial from the east. At least 200, maybe more. Looks like the entire staff and patient population from St. Luke's." The news sent a ripple of despair through the defenders because their ammunition was running low, their arms were getting tired, and their defensive line was already stretched to the breaking point. That's when Fire Captain Angela Morrison proved why she'd earned her rank and the respect of everyone who worked with her. "Rodriguez, pull your people back behind the fire engines. We're going to create a barrier they can't cross." She was already directing her crew to spray fire suppressant foam across the entire width of Memorial Drive, creating a slick surface that the creature's uncoordinated movements couldn't navigate. Then she ordered something that made Rebecca's stomach clench with its audacity: "Pour the fuel reserves in a line across 5th Street and prepare to ignite on my command." It was dangerous, possibly illegal, definitely not in any official fire department protocol, but Morrison understood that normal rules had died the moment the dead had started walking. Lieutenant Rodriguez didn't hesitate, trusting the fire captain's expertise just as Morrison was trusting the police to protect her crew while they worked. The officers fell back to the new position, establishing firing lanes between the massive fire engines while Morrison's firefighters worked with practiced efficiency to set up what was essentially a firewall between the living and the dead. The eastern horde rounded the corner just as the preparations were complete, and Rebecca felt her heart sink at the sight of so many bodies moving in eerie unison toward their position, hundreds of people who'd gone to the hospital seeking healing and had instead found only death and grotesque reanimation. Fire Captain Morrison stood with her hand raised, waiting for the optimal moment, her scarred arm steady as she judged distances and wind conditions with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime understanding how fire behaved. The creatures shuffled forward, crossing onto the fuel-soaked pavement, their moans rising to a fever pitch as they sensed living flesh just ahead. Morrison's hand dropped, and the world exploded into flame. The wall of flame roared to life with a sound like the breath of an angry god, and for a moment the night turned to day as orange and yellow light painted the horrified faces of the creatures that stumbled directly into the inferno. The smell hit immediately, burning flesh and hair mixed with fuel and foam, creating a stench so overwhelming that several officers doubled over retching, though they never stopped watching the line, never lowered their weapons. The firewall served its purpose magnificently, turning the intersection into an impassable barrier that the undead horde couldn't comprehend or navigate around, their minimal brain function unable to process the danger until they were already engulfed in flames. Some of the burning creatures continued walking for several steps before collapsing, their bodies adding to a growing wall of charred remains that actually reinforced the barrier Fire Captain Angela Morrison had created. Lieutenant Jennifer Rodriguez allowed herself exactly 10 seconds to feel relief before her tactical mind was already racing ahead to the next problem, the next decision, the next impossible choice that would determine who lived and who died tonight. Officer Rebecca Martinez used the brief respite to check her radio, desperately hoping for an update from her sister Maria, and her heart nearly exploded with relief when she heard Maria's whispered voice reporting that the sounds in the neighborhood had moved away, that she and the kids were still safe in their attic hideaway. "Stay there until I come for you or until you hear National Guard on the streets," Rebecca instructed, blinking back tears she couldn't afford to shed right now. "Don't trust anyone who doesn't identify themselves properly. Don't open the door for neighbors or friends. The people we knew are gone, Maria. Only trust official rescue teams." The words felt like knives coming out of her mouth, the acknowledgement that their quiet suburban neighborhood had become a hunting ground where former friends and neighbors now posed the deadliest threat imaginable. Officer Catherine Wilson placed a hand on Rebecca's shoulder, a brief moment of human connection that said more than words ever could, then both women returned to their positions because the firewall wouldn't burn forever and they needed to be ready for whatever came next. Officer Vanessa Price had been coordinating with the other defensive positions scattered across the city, and the picture she painted for Lieutenant Rodriguez was grim but not hopeless. 3 other strong positions were holding, one at the Civic Center commanded by Captain Marcus Thompson, one at Jefferson High School led by Sergeant Patricia Wells, and one at the Eastern Bridge headed by Lieutenant Sarah Blackwood. Between these 4 defensive points, they were protecting approximately 40,000 civilians who'd either made it to the safe zones or were sheltering in place in the residential areas behind the perimeters. But the math was brutal. The city's population was nearly 500,000, which meant there were hundreds of thousands of people still out there, either hiding in terror or already turned into shambling monsters. Officer Lisa Morgan called down from her rooftop position with an observation that chilled everyone who heard it. "The creatures are learning. I'm watching groups of them on the side streets, and they're starting to avoid the fire. They're moving around it, trying to find another way to us." The implications were staggering because it suggested some kind of collective intelligence or perhaps just evolutionary pressure. The ones stupid enough to walk into fire were eliminated, leaving only those with enough residual brain function to seek alternate routes. Officer Michelle Turner emerged from the bank building with a bandaged civilian, a young woman named Emily Harper who'd been hiding in her apartment when a neighbor who'd turned had broken through her door. Emily had fought off her attacker with a baseball bat and fled through a window, running through streets filled with nightmares until she'd spotted the lights of the defensive position. "She's not bitten, I checked thoroughly," Michelle reported, though everyone could hear the unspoken concern in her voice because how many more survivors were out there, trying to reach safety through a city that had become a maze of death. Lieutenant Rodriguez made a decision that demonstrated why her officers trusted her implicitly. "Price, get on the radio to all positions. We need to establish rescue protocols for survivors trying to reach our lines. We can't just hunker down and wait for the National Guard while people die out there." Officer Diana Campbell volunteered immediately, stepping forward with Officer Amanda Stevens right behind her. "We can take a patrol car, do sweeps of the residential zones, bring back anyone we find." The plan was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was also exactly what every officer in that intersection had signed up for when they took their oath to protect and serve. Fire Captain Morrison was monitoring the firewall with a practiced eye, and she pulled Rodriguez aside for a private conversation that Rebecca could tell from body language wasn't good news. The flames were already beginning to die down, and they had maybe 20 minutes before the barrier would be passable for the creatures that were even now gathering in the darkness beyond the light, their moans a constant reminder that the siege was far from over. Rodriguez called her officers together for a quick briefing, her face set in determined lines. "The National Guard is still 90 minutes out. We need to hold this position and we need to start bringing in survivors. Campbell and Stevens, you're authorized for rescue sweeps but stay in constant radio contact. Turner, set up a proper intake screening for anyone we bring in, we can't risk letting infected people behind our lines. Wilson, Martinez, you're with me. We're going to expand our perimeter building by building and create a real safe zone here." Then she added words that transformed exhausted, terrified officers back into the brave defenders the city needed. "We've held this long, and we're going to hold longer. Those things out there used to be our neighbors, our friends, maybe even our family. We owe it to who they were to stop what they've become from spreading any further." Officer Diana Campbell's patrol car rolled slowly through streets that had been transformed into something from a fever dream, every shadow potentially hiding death, every sound making her finger tighten on the trigger of her service weapon. Beside her, Officer Amanda Stevens swept a high-powered flashlight across abandoned vehicles and shattered storefronts, the beam occasionally catching the pale face of a creature that would immediately lurch toward the light like a moth to flame, forcing Diana to make the difficult calculation of whether engaging would save survivors or simply draw more attention to their position. They'd rescued 4 people so far, an elderly man named Robert Chin who'd barricaded himself in a grocery store freezer, a mother and daughter named Patricia and Emma Rodriguez hiding in a bathroom, and a teenager named Jake Morrison who'd climbed into a tree and stayed there for 3 hours while the undead gathered below. Each rescue had required careful planning, split-second timing, and a measure of luck that Diana knew couldn't hold forever, but still they pressed deeper into the residential zones because the radio kept crackling with desperate voices calling for help, and neither officer could ignore those pleas. Back at the intersection, Lieutenant Jennifer Rodriguez was orchestrating the expansion of their safe zone with the precision of a chess master, sending pairs of officers to clear buildings room by room, establishing proper sight lines and fallback positions. Officer Catherine Wilson and Officer Rebecca Martinez had just finished securing a 3-story apartment building when they heard scratching coming from behind a locked door on the 2nd floor. Kate positioned herself with weapon drawn while Rebecca called out, "Police. Identify yourself." The response came in a child's voice, small and terrified, "My name is Sophie Martinez. My mom won't wake up." Rebecca felt her blood turn to ice because the name Martinez could be coincidence but the location was right for her sister's friend from book club, and when they breached the door, her worst fears were confirmed. The little girl was maybe 7 years old, huddled in a closet, and on the bed lay her mother with a bite mark on her arm and the pale, waxy complexion that meant she'd passed beyond help, though not yet begun to reanimate. "We need to get her out of here now," Kate said urgently, already moving to scoop up the child, and Rebecca forced herself to do what needed to be done, putting a single round through the dead woman's head before the transformation could occur, trying not to see the accusation in young Sophie's eyes even though the girl was too shocked to fully understand what had just happened. Officer Vanessa Price's coordination with the other defensive positions revealed that the situation across the city was stabilizing in some areas while deteriorating rapidly in others. Captain Marcus Thompson's position at the Civic Center was holding strong with over 8,000 civilians sheltered in the massive building complex, but Lieutenant Sarah Blackwood's position at the Eastern Bridge had come under sustained assault from what she estimated as 1,000 creatures, possibly the entire population of the nearby prison finally reaching the city proper. Sergeant Patricia Wells at Jefferson High School reported that her defensive line had rescued nearly 200 survivors but was now running critically low on ammunition, requesting immediate resupply that no one could provide because every position was facing the same shortage. Lieutenant Rodriguez made the difficult decision to consolidate, ordering Wells to load all civilians into school buses and make a run for the civic center where Thompson had better fortifications and more resources. The maneuver would be dangerous, possibly catastrophic if the convoy was intercepted, but staying put meant certain death once the ammunition ran out. Fire Captain Angela Morrison's crews had managed to establish 3 more firebreaks using vehicle barriers soaked in fuel, creating a box perimeter around the intersection that gave them breathing room, but the fire chief pulled Rodriguez aside with news that made the lieutenant's jaw clench. "We're getting reports that some fires from the initial chaos are spreading out of control. There's a warehouse district on the south side that's fully engulfed, and the wind is pushing it toward residential areas. I need to pull my crews to fight that fire or we're going to lose entire neighborhoods, but that means you lose the firebreak protection." Rodriguez understood the impossible position Morrison was in: fight the undead or fight the fire, but not both, and she made the only choice she could. "Go. Save the neighborhoods. We'll hold with what we have." The two women shook hands, a moment of mutual respect between professionals who'd both given everything they had to protect their city. Officer Michelle Turner's medical station had processed 43 survivors now, each one screened carefully for bites or scratches, each one carrying stories of horror that would take years of therapy to process if any of them lived long enough to try. She'd set up a counseling corner where Officer Lisa Morgan, who had a degree in psychology from before joining the force, was helping people work through the immediate trauma, keeping panic from spreading like its own kind of contagion. The wounded spirit could be as dangerous as the wounded flesh in a crisis situation. Then Turner's radio crackled with Diana Campbell's voice, strained and urgent. "We need immediate backup at the corner of Maple and 8th. We found a group of 20 survivors trapped in a church, but there are at least 100 creatures surrounding the building. We can't extract them alone." Lieutenant Rodriguez didn't hesitate, grabbing her tactical vest and looking at Kate and Rebecca. "Mount up. We're going to bring our people home." As they raced toward the besieged church, Rebecca thought about her sister and her niece and nephew still hiding in their attic, about little Sophie who'd just watched her mother die, about all the innocent people depending on a thin line of brave women to stand between them and the nightmare that had consumed their world. The church at Maple and 8th stood like a besieged fortress, its Gothic spire reaching toward a sky that was just beginning to show the first hints of dawn, and surrounding it was a sea of undead bodies that pressed against the heavy oak doors with relentless determination. Officer Diana Campbell and Officer Amanda Stevens had positioned their patrol car a block away, using the vehicle's PA system to draw some of the creatures away from the church, but the tactic had only limited success because the things could apparently sense the larger concentration of living flesh inside the building. Lieutenant Jennifer Rodriguez arrived with reinforcements, Officers Catherine Wilson, Rebecca Martinez, Lisa Morgan, and Vanessa Price, transforming a desperate situation into something that might actually be survivable with the right tactics and a lot of courage. Rodriguez surveyed the scene with the quick assessment that had kept her people alive through the longest night of their lives, then outlined a plan that was simple, dangerous, and their only real option. "We create a corridor. 2 fire teams lay down suppressing fire to clear a path from the church to the vehicles. Campbell and Stevens, you get those people loaded and moving. We'll cover your retreat." The plan went into motion with the synchronized precision of a well-rehearsed dance, though every step was improvised on the edge of disaster. Kate and Rebecca took the left flank, their weapons firing in controlled bursts that dropped creatures with headshots while conserving ammunition. Lisa and Vanessa held the right, and between them they created a narrow corridor of relative safety that led from the church's front entrance to the waiting patrol cars. Diana and Amanda sprinted through the gauntlet, reaching the church doors and pounding on them while creatures lunged from both sides, only to be cut down by covering fire from their fellow officers. The doors opened to reveal a young priest named Father Michael Brooks and 20 terrified parishioners who'd been attending a late-night prayer vigil when the world ended. "Move quickly, stay together, don't stop for anything," Diana commanded, her voice cutting through their shock and fear, transforming them from paralyzed victims into people who might actually survive the next 5 minutes. The evacuation was chaos barely contained by discipline, elderly women helped along by younger men, children carried in arms, everyone moving as fast as their terror would allow while the officers maintained their firing lanes with ammunition counters dropping towards zero. That's when Rebecca heard the sound that meant either salvation or a different kind of doom, the deep thrum of heavy helicopters approaching from the east, followed by the rumble of military vehicles on the streets. The National Guard had arrived early, their convoy led by Major Christine Anderson, a 30-year military veteran whose cool assessment of the situation took in everything she needed to know in seconds. All officers, fall back to our position. We're establishing a hardened perimeter and we have the firepower to hold it. The Guard troops deployed with military efficiency, their M4 carbines and squad automatic weapons creating a wall of suppressing fire that made the officers' handguns look like toys by comparison. Armored personnel carriers formed physical barriers while soldiers in tactical gear began the systematic elimination of creatures that had occupied the surrounding blocks. Lieutenant Rodriguez coordinated with Major Anderson, sharing intelligence about the other defensive positions, about the thousands of civilians sheltering across the city, about the brave men and women who'd held the line until help could arrive. Rebecca finally had the chance to do what she'd been desperate to do for hours. She requisitioned a National Guard Humvee and raced toward her sister's neighborhood with Kate riding shotgun. The streets were still dangerous, still filled with scattered groups of creatures, but the armored vehicle pushed through them like they were nothing, and when they reached Maria's house, Rebecca was already out and running before the vehicle fully stopped. She found her sister and her niece and nephew exactly where she'd told them to stay, in the attic with furniture barricaded against the access door, and the reunion was tears and desperate hugs and the kind of relief that made Rebecca's knees weak. "I told you I'd come," she whispered into her sister's hair, and Maria just held her tighter, unable to speak through the sobs. They loaded into the Humvee along with 3 other families from the block who'd survived the night by luck and locked doors, and as they drove back toward the safe zone, Rebecca watched the sun finally break over the horizon, painting the devastated city in shades of gold and red. The intersection at 5th and Memorial had been transformed into a proper military encampment, with Guard units establishing a perimeter that extended for 6 blocks in all directions. Officer Michelle Turner was working alongside Army medics to process survivors, while Officer Diana Campbell and Officer Amanda Stevens were finally able to rest, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline crash. Fire Captain Angela Morrison returned with news that the warehouse fire had been contained and her crews were now assisting with the evacuation of outlying neighborhoods. Lieutenant Rodriguez gathered her officers, these brave women who'd faced the impossible and refused to break, and for a moment she couldn't find words adequate to express what she felt. "You saved this city," she finally said simply. "When everything fell apart, you held the line. You are the reason thousands of people will see another day." The fight was far from over, the undead still controlled large portions of the city, and the infection had spread to neighboring communities, but in that moment, watching the sun rise on a world forever changed, the officers of the night shift allowed themselves to believe they might actually survive this. They'd stood their ground when the undead arrived, and though the cost had been terrible and the battle was far from won, they'd proven that courage and determination could hold back even the darkest tide. The nightmare wasn't over, but they'd made it through the night, and sometimes that was enough. The end.